All right, I have just an incredible guest to share with my community here today. I have Max Blumenthal, who has been doing independent journalism for over 20 years. He's on the cutting edge of all of the big stories that you care about, that I care about. And so we're going to go over some of those today. Max, thank you so much for taking time out of your day to come on the show.
Yeah, absolutely, Stephen. And apologies for my non-cutting edge shot. Normally, I'd be in my studio at home, but I'm on the road with my family. We're in Nicaragua right now, so I'm just in a room, and this is the best shot I could get.
Hey, no, it's great. You're down covering the news and spending time with the family. So thank you for stepping away. So I've seen your work for probably about 3 years now, not 20, but about three. And you seem to always have a pulse on what's really going on with big stories that Fox News, MSNBC, ABC, they don't want to cover appropriately, or they give coverage in order to push a specific narrative. But recently, you were invited to, I guess, testify or give an opinion of evidence for the reasons why the United Nations and the United States should push to immediately exit the Russia-Ukraine war. Would you mind going over some of those with my audience? Because there is so much war propaganda and lies in the media. I'm doing my best to just bring the very best information to people.
Well, what I was doing at the UN Security Council was just using a elite forum to draw out the contradictions in this war between the interests of the American people, of whom I'm a part, regardless of whether they're right or left or where they stand politically. There's just a giant mass of American people who aren't benefiting from this war, and the true beneficiaries of the war, who are the 1%, the arms industry, the people who have skin in the game, and a lot of the people you see in Washington, D.C., who, I live in Washington, so I know who they are, how much their homes cost. The ones flying Ukraine flags, they have a vested interest, at least an ideological interest in this war, because they've been so propagandized by the legacy media. So I was trying to draw that distinction by showing what the American people, average Americans, were going through, whether they're having toxic chemicals dumped in their communities because infrastructure is collapsing, because trains are turning over in these small towns that everyone's forgotten about in flyover country, whether they're, experiencing the knockoff effects of the knock-on effects of the lockdown, still, of remote learning where their kids have been left behind in school, and just general inequality, and then the massive profits that are being made by the arms industry and what we call the Beltway bandits, the contractors who do the work, the DAIs, the Chemonics, the Booz Allens. They bring in the aid, they siphon off money from these contracts. The private contractors who are getting arms deals that we've never even heard of. We found out about this diving company that was so corrupted that the Armed Service Committee chairman in the Senate, Tom Tillis, actually called them a fraudulent company. And we found Atlantic Diving Company, that they were getting massive contracts to deliver sapper equipment and small boats to the Ukrainian military. This is one of the most corrupt companies you can think of. And their CEO, he has beachfront property in the Bahamas, beachfront property in Hawaii. He owns a yacht. And these people are doing so well off this war. And so they would like to see it go on for as long as possible. And then what I did towards the end of this speech was point the finger directly at the Biden administration, the key principles in the Biden administration, and show how they have a vested financial interest, material interest in continuing this war because of their association with firms like West Exec Advisors. This was co-founded by Tony Blinken, and it was Tony Blinken, and I believe well, I'll remember the founder in a second, but pretty much everyone associated with Biden's national security team, and even Jen Psaki, had some involvement with West Exec Advisors, basically a lobbying firm or a consulting firm in Washington that took Obama's State Department national security team. And after Trump came in, they just decided to hump in contracts for big tech and other companies with the Pentagon and the diplomatic corps and the Beltway bandits because they had all these contacts. Avril Haines, director of national intelligence, was involved. Who's who? Jake Sullivan was involved. Then you have Lloyd Austin, the defense secretary, who's a Raytheon board member. Raytheon stocks have been surging since this war's been going on. And then Linda Thomas Greenfield, the UN ambassador. She unfortunately wasn't present for my speech, just her team, but I named her because she is a part of the Albright Stonebridge group founded by the late Madeleine Albright, who said that the death of 500,000 Iraqi children through starvation sanctions was worth it. Of course, it's worth it if you're a war profiteer. And Albright Stonebridge is just like West Exec Advisors. Its role is to finesse contracts for various companies who are seeking, a place at the trough, the corporate welfare trough of the Pentagon. Even 60 Minutes, not exactly an anti-war program, has exposed what the defense budget is really about, that over 50% of it goes to corrupt contractors and we can't even keep track of it. This has nothing to do with protecting our country. In fact, the Navy secretary himself has warned that we're sending so much armaments to Ukraine, so many weapon systems, that there won't be anything left or enough left to defend America's periphery. I mean, if you are in the America First mindset, that's an absolute crime. That's not my mindset, but if you are, you believe in this concept of defense, that there is a Defense Department. It was renamed the Defense Department, was originally called the War Department, and that's what it is. Then what's taking place in Ukraine is actually weakening American national security and America's ability to defend itself, but it's also enriching a certain class of people who are connected not just to the Democratic Party, but to the dominant wing of the Republican Party that's represented by Mitch McConnell, Lindsey Graham, and these uniparty figures who are funded by the arms industry and by these contractors and are connected to corporate America. So that was really the essence of my speech, and it went viral for a variety of reasons. One, because it spoke to a lot of people in the US who feel like they're being betrayed by this war, including former service members. Heather Kaiser is a former US military intelligence officer who served in Iraq and Afghanistan, felt the moral injury of that war, saw many of her friends die pointlessly, and helped contribute to my research on that speech with a really important piece we published at thegrayzone.com that was one of the first independent audits of all of this aid to Ukraine. And, I think she speaks for a lot of people within the military, active duty people in the military who see the folly of this war, but also just many Americans who see all this money going to the most corrupt country or second most corrupt country in Europe, one of the most corrupt countries in the world, while nothing is coming to them. Yeah. I mean, you look at Washington, D.C., all this luxury housing going up to house the mid-level contractors. There's no affordable housing going up there. Then the speech started going viral in Spain. It got translated into Spanish because in Spain, that government has been sending hundreds of millions of dollars to Ukraine too, while Spanish youth actually are now, some of them are going to Morocco to find work. They have no future in Spain, and their government refuses to allow them to speak out against this war. So they just saw me as someone who was speaking out. They wanted to share it. It felt good to see someone say that in an elite forum. Then it went viral, started going around Eastern Europe, where people are formally banned. In Poland, they're passing laws to ban pro-Russian opinions, not just, Russian meddling, but pro-Russian opinions. Then it got translated into Japanese, a country that has borne the brunt of US nuclear weapons and is being turned into a base, just like Ukraine, to fight another proxy war, this one against China, which would be even more disastrous than the one against Russia, against another nuclear power. And Japanese people, the ones who aren't completely propagandized into oblivion, which seems to be the case, unfortunately, with much of Japanese civil society, they started sharing it as well. So it became a phenomenon, and it's not about me necessarily. It's just about how the global public really feels about this war. And that's not even to mention how Africans feel about it. They depended so much on grain from Russia and Ukraine, and they are facing food riots. They can feel it much more, the impact much more directly than anyone in the US.
Yeah.
And it all comes down to I think it all comes down to how this elite sect within Washington, this uniparty sect, sees Russia and Ukraine ideologically and financially.
Yeah, yeah. The profiteering is incredible. I don't know if you're familiar with Ray McGovern.
Ray's a
Yeah.
friend.
Okay, he also testified before the UN Security Council, which is how I discovered him, and he pointed out to me that this may be one of the biggest money grabs in world history, and the American people are completely blind to it because it's not our boys and girls dying. So as long as it's Ukrainians that are dying, then these companies can make profits with nobody questioning them, nobody pushing back, nobody saying, hey, should Raytheon be making all this money while US soldiers die in Afghanistan or Iraq? We don't have men and women over there directly. And so he says they're just grabbing money as fast as their hands can move because it's not American soldiers dying.
Completely. And the people who are behind a lot of this have never even served or seen war themselves. I mean, especially in the State Department. You look at Victoria Nuland, who was just promoted to Deputy Secretary of State, replacing Wendy Sherman. She's right behind Tony Blinken right now. What was her role before she was in this administration, while Trump was in office? She was at CNAS, Center for New American Security. This is a think tank that functions kind of as the intellectual ancillary of the people around West Exec Advisors. And look at who funds CNAS. It's Raytheon, it's Lockheed Martin, it's the US government, the British government, and all the Beltway bandits. So where's she going to go after this administration? She'll probably go back there, and her salary will be paid for by the people who are profiting from this war, by the sinister entities that are profiting from this war. Every think tank expert you see quoted on this war, almost everyone comes from an arms industry funded think tank. I would say 95%. Responsible Statecraft at the Quincy Institute has produced several studies showing that over 90% of those quoted are from arms industry funded think tanks.
So this is why they won't come on my show. I kept trying to figure out why can't I get these people on my show? I finally track them down. I invite them to come on, and they're like, nope, no, thank you.
Yep.
Nope.
They will never debate. No, they will never debate. They will never answer critical questions. It's a complete Potemkin village in Washington. And all they're doing is pretending to be independent analysts when they're actually public relations assets for the arms industry, big tech, and the contractors. And then that's also the role of the press. The press are stenographers for these entities, but they have to conceal their stenography through the opinions of supposedly independent experts who are actually it's just pay to play. Yeah. And then the public who consumes these publications, the Washington Post, for example, they've lost $100 million in the past year. They're owned by one of the 4 richest men in the world. He doesn't care if they're losing money. It exists primarily for the purpose of propagandizing the intelligentsia, making sure that the liberal urban public that actually subscribes to these publications and is the only, comprises a very small percentage of the American public, that they think a certain way. So I grew up in Washington, D.C., in an area called Tacoma, D.C. in a political family. And Washington and that political class was much more progressive and skeptical of war when I was growing up. On the other side of the DC border was a town called Tacoma Park. The representative there is named Jamie Raskin. Okay, Tacoma Park was one of the most anti-war areas in America. They passed a resolution banning nuclear weapons to kind of poke their finger at Ronald Reagan at the time. There were every July 4th, they'd have a parade where they would protest arms to the Contras, and all sorts of anti-war activity would be featured in their July 4th parade. Jamie Raskin's father was Marcus Raskin, who founded the first anti-war think tank in Washington called IPS. And Jamie Raskin is one of the most pro-war representatives. That area, Tacoma Park, is fluttering with Ukraine flags over now multi-million-dollar Victorian homes, which used to cost very little and were like kind of home to like retired hippies. The contractor money's flowing into that area. So if I can just look at the area I grew up in as a microcosm of what's happened to liberal America, you can really see the entire transformation from coast to coast there. And this war has become a symbol to them of everything they're fighting for. Because as Jamie Raskin said, Putin is a homophobic bigot and authoritarian, and Ukraine is fighting for democracy. So they see it as kind of a stand-in for the culture war that they're fighting in the US against conservatives, where they're fighting for the LGBTQIA plus community against Ron DeSantis and Donald Trump's bigotry. That's the same thing that Vladimir Zelenskyy, this former actor who has all of the, appears at all of these celebrity glitzy events like the Oscars and the Emmys. That's what he's fighting for against the homophobic Putin. And it's just not the reality on the ground there. Ukrainian and Russian societies are very similar, but they've concocted this completely phony construct. And so that's the ideological component. We've talked about the financial component, the material interest that this uniparty class has in this war, but there's also an ideological component that explains the deep liberal political investment in this war. And as you said, Stephen, Americans aren't dying, so they don't care about the fact that this week alone, 4 out of 5 Ukrainian attacks and its counteroffensive were brutalized by Russian artillery, Russian missiles, and we can't even imagine how many Ukrainian young men were wasted in these pointless head-on attacks into the teeth of the heavily entrenched Russian positions around Zaporozhye. But these people who believe that they're fighting some kind of culture war, they don't care. They don't see it. You don't see they're not seeing photos of these young men's charred bodies, their arms blown off. They're not seeing the growing cemeteries across Ukraine. You can only see that on Telegram and on social media. It should be featured on the front pages of every publication, the way that the coffins of American soldiers coming back from Iraq from the Dover Air Base were finally featured. And that was the real turning point in that war that drove Bush's approval rating from the high 60s, with no shortage of Democratic support at the dawn of the so-called war on terror, into subterranean 20% territory by 2005.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Did you think it was telling at this most recent NATO conference? There's all these pictures of all these NATO world leaders. They're in tuxedos, nice dresses, jewelry. They're hobnobbing with each other. None of them are talking to Zelenskyy. Like, all they care about is using him in the media to make themselves look good. And then at this social gathering of the 1% of the 1%, they completely ignore him. They think the cameras are off. They don't give a crap about this guy. It's so sad. And I say this stuff, and then people are like, "Oh, you're pro-Russian." I'm like, no, I'm pro getting out of this. People are being murdered left and right. It's awful. Yeah. This is a humanitarian crisis.
Yeah. I mean, I couldn't have said it more clearly. So it speaks to what Zelenskyy is and what he always has been. Not a lot of attention was paid to Zelensky in 2019. I don't know if had you paid any much
I
attention?
didn't know who he was. I didn't know the
Yeah,
United States had performed a coup. I didn't know any of that.
yeah.
I was living the American life of consuming and going about my life and trying to raise my children. And now my eyes are open, and it's like sometimes I wish that they could close again.
Well, yeah, they never will close again, and you'll never be able to unsee this. And I think in some ways it's liberating, but it's also painful. What comforts me is just seeing people like yourself and so many people from so many diverse political backgrounds waking up to what's happening. If you're watching this now and this is new to you, learn about the other coups. Where I'm sitting in Nicaragua, the U.S. attempted a violent coup by sponsoring all of these chaos agents through NGOs and different activist groups in the media to tear this country apart in 2018 to try to topple a popular government that was really popular among the poor and working class of this country. And they called it a dictatorship. They set the country on fire in 2018, terrorized people, brought in narco hooligans, did everything. They shut down the country's economy for several months. And then when the government finally stepped in and said enough, they accused it of all kinds of human rights crimes. And that's happened across Eastern Europe. It's what we call a color revolution. It happened all across Eastern Europe, starting after the deliberate destruction of Yugoslavia. The U.S. started funding first through its inside outside operators like George Soros. A lot of conservatives hate Soros because they associate him with Black Lives Matter or drug legalization. What Soros's primary role was actually funding these color revolutions on behalf of the U.S. government, so the U.S. government wouldn't have fingerprints in Eastern Europe. And the U.S. was also funding them through the National Endowment for Democracy. It's really important to learn about that organization. It's an NGO, but it's sponsored entirely through Congress. And they fund all these NGOs to conduct regime change and destabilization operations in countries where the U.S. seeks regime change. And one by one, the former Soviet republics, even though they wanted good relations with the U.S., would fall to these color revolutions of hopeful young people. And then the U.S. would come in, the U.S. corporations would come in, and they would raid all the public assets, privatize everything. And then all those young people who are out in the streets would realize, wait a minute, we're poor now. We're being exploited. We might actually have to move west and become migrants. And meanwhile, Putin is sitting there in Moscow noticing that these countries are joining NATO, that they're falling one by one, that they're not neutral anymore. They're not having relations with the US and Russia as was intended. And they're getting closer and closer to his border. And then the US is moving dual-use Aegis missile systems into places like Poland. So they can suddenly reach Moscow with missiles. What's he going to do? The 2007 Munich Security Conference, Putin has John McCain and Joe Lieberman, two of the biggest neocons in Congress, sitting in the front row. And he says, enough. What you did in Iraq and what you were doing with these color revolutions has to stop. And Russia is going to put a stop to it. The following year, Georgia, a country that had a color revolution run by Mikhail Saakashvili, who is a longtime CIA asset, invades South Ossetia with a large Russian population. You can look at this as the preview of the Ukraine proxy war. And Putin just puts his foot down, brings in the full brunt of the Russian military, crushes Georgia. Saakashvili seen on TV eating his tie. He's freaking out. The U.S. completely divorces itself from Saakashvili, said, this guy's too crazy for us. We're not supporting you. We have nothing to do with this, but we're going to, wag the finger at Russia, just like they're doing to Zelenskyy right now. And Saakashvili, it's been all downhill for him ever since. So as soon as Putin started putting the foot down, first, they tried the hit the reset button with Putin. That failed because there were too many extremists in the Obama administration. Michael McFaul being one. I'm sure you've seen him on MSNBC. All he does is call for more weapons, more attacks. He was kicked out of Russia in 2012 because he was trying to organize a color revolution inside Moscow, and the Russians were not going to allow that. He was filmed on camera bringing the key leaders of the Russian opposition, the anti-Putin opposition, to the U.S. embassy to conduct plans. And, the Kremlin sent out their friendly media people to embarrass them. But imagine if the Russian embassy, which is located on Wisconsin Ave in Washington, D.C., just north of Georgetown, hosted the leaders of Black Lives Matter, the Proud Boys, and every opposition group they could think of to have a big gala and start planning a destabilization operation. Do you think the U.S. government would tolerate that? Hell no. So McFaul has been, ever since then, determined to destroy Putin along with his clique, because Putin will not allow the U.S. to shape the outcome of Russia's national interests. 2012, 2014, the Maidan coup. That was the turning point. I think a historical turning point that will determine what happens in the next 50 years. And the outcome will not benefit U.S. empire. Ukraine should have been allowed to remain, or encouraged to remain, neutral. But because of this, the U.S. turning it into another kind of Israel or Taiwan, what former Secretary of State Alexander Haig referred to as a unsinkable aircraft carrier in Israel, the U.S. will ultimately be weakened, because for Russia, Ukraine is the ultimate red line, particularly Crimea. I mean, it's their only deep water port in Sevastopol. They had this horrible confrontation with Nazi Germany over Sevastopol. One of the biggest tragedies of the war for Russia was the Soviet Union was having to leave there, evacuating a few people by submarine while the rest were left to the Nazis. They will never allow that to happen again.